welcome everybody to Stand Together, United Against Anti-Asian Discrimination Town Hall, brought to you by the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. Our event today has interpretation available in Cantonese. Please make sure that once this announcement is over, you will see a globe show in your webinar controls. Please select interpretation and click the language that you would like to hear this event in. If you would like to listen to it in English, please select English. If you'd like to listen to it in Chinese, please select Chinese. There is an option for you to also hear the interpreted language only. So you can click mute original audio. Maggie, and now we'll share the information in Cantonese.
你哋好，我哋今日嘅主題嘅城市論壇主題係站在同一陣線，聯合對抗反亞裔歧視。咁如果我哋今日咧為今日嘅論壇咧提供呢個廣東話嘅即時傳譯服務。如果你哋需要傳譯服務嘅話，而中文嘅你就可以選擇中文，需要英文亦都可以選擇英文。跟住亦都有提供其他語言嘅，你可以按照嘅語言嚟選擇你需要嘅傳譯服務。多謝。
Welcome to Stand Together, Uniting Against Anti-Asian Discrimination Town Hall hosted by San Francisco Human Rights Commission. I'm Michelle Meow. I host and produce programs at the Commonwealth Club of California and KBCW San Francisco Bay Area. This is the first of many town hall discussions that we will do to address the issues of anti-Asian discrimination and what we need to do to come together as communities. And so we'll try to get to all of the concerning major issues today, but if we don't worry, this is one of many other town hall discussions that we'll do. Before we begin our program, here are a couple of special leaders here in the city who have some remarks. I'd like to introduce you to Sheryl Davis, who's the Executive Director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. Director Davis.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and I look forward to the conversation with our panelists. We are really grateful for this opportunity to pause and be in conversation with each other. We will continue to have conversations. We are saddened by the increase in hate incidents and hate crimes, but we are heartened by the love and compassion and the ability for communities to come together. I want to recognize Mayor London Breed, who will be speaking to you next, who earlier this year had conversations with different communities and really heard that we needed to do more and to be more responsive to our Asian community and to be more responsive in not just talk, but in deeds and in collaboration and partnership. And I want to also recognize Claudine Chen, who really held us to that and came back and said, what are we going to do? And how do we make sure that we're doing this together in partnership and collaboration? So tonight is the first of a series of conversations, but more than conversations, we really want to connect with community to move this forward, to be action-oriented, to talk about how we come together in space, how we come together in support, and how we really drown out the racist verbiage, and that we really work together to make San Francisco a place where we all come and live in unity and harmony. So thank you so much, Mayor Breed, for your guidance and your leadership and for your urging and for this opportunity to convene with community.
多謝咧，係London Breed 咧，係今日咧係幫我哋係
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you to all the people joining us here today and these amazing panelists. I know we're looking forward to hearing from. This is a really important issue that we clearly need to discuss, issue around racial discrimination. And I think the whole goal is to send a unified message that we will have zero tolerance here in San Francisco for hate of any kind. I've heard from so many people in our Asian community about the experiences that they've had, and recently, especially after the coronavirus pandemic. They've shared really sad stories about being targeted for racist and hateful verbal and physical assaults solely based on their race. And I understand what that feels like, to have hateful racist language spewed at you, to have physical violence directed at you or the ones you love, being afraid to be in certain spaces because you're not sure if it's safe. This is an experience and a trauma that the African American community shares with the Asian American community. We are judged based on what we look like, and people who are full of fear and full of hate, they see our differences as a way to target us. And I take these concerns very seriously. I've made it clear to Chief Scott, to the San Francisco Police Department, the district attorney, that we have to work together to not only hold people accountable, but to also have the hard conversations that prevent these incidents from happening in the first place. People's level of prejudice is directly correlated with their perception of what society finds acceptable. We know that social norms can be incredibly powerful when it comes to driving attitudes about people. It's not a surprise that, sadly, under this federal administration and the hateful and racist language that the president uses, like calling the coronavirus the Kung flu or the Wuhan flu, hate crime reports have increased significantly, even reaching our children. Perpetrators of these kinds of crime towards our children is something that we will not continue to tolerate. But sadly, we know that this kind of racism is not new. In fact, the Asian community here in San Francisco has been the target of racist state actions that decimated their communities and their culture. Urban renewal and redevelopment didn't just destroy the African American community in the Fillmore, it also decimated Manilatown and Japantown and displaced thousands of people in all of these communities, our communities. Black and Asian folks weren't even allowed to live in certain areas of this city in the past and had to create their own mutual aid networks to be able to buy property or own a business. At one point in time, San Francisco refused to allow Chinese or Black children to attend any public schools in this city. That was a California state law, in fact. Vincent Chen and James Byrd Jr., both of these men died because of the hateful actions of racists who judged them solely on what they looked like. Massacres of entire towns like Greenwood, Oklahoma, where hundreds of African Americans were killed and thousands displaced. Many know of this now as the Tulsa Race Massacre. That just didn't happen to the Black community. Chinatowns across this country were erased by racist violence, and many were shot or lynched, again, on the basis of nothing more than the color of our skin. That's why here in San Francisco, we have to come together. We have to denounce violence and hateful speech, not just because it's happening to our community, but because of how it impacts other communities as well. We need to send a strong signal that San Francisco will not tolerate racial discrimination and that we will stand together to oppose hate against any one of us. Because when you come for one of us, you come for all of us. We have stood together before, and we do so again. We will be there for one another, just like Frederick Douglass hundreds of years ago, who opposed and spoke out against the racist Chinese Exclusionary Act, or how freedom fighters voiced their opposition to the Emergency Detention Act that resulted in the internment of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. We know that these really horrible, tragic incidents of the past should not continue and be repeated now and into the future. We don't want our children to continue to grow up thinking that how we treat people based on their race, when we are violent or aggressive towards them, that that's okay. It's not okay. And it's time for all of us as leaders in the African American and the Asian community to stand up, to have the hard conversations about the prejudices that we all have and how we deal with them and how we support and uplift one another. This is where we are in that time. Let me just close by saying that I appreciate the commitment of everyone at this town hall. to have this much this much needed conversation about race. Thank you so much, not only to the panelists, but the people who are joining us. It's so important that we talk about what we can do to support each other. And it's important that we not only have this conversation with one another, we also have the hard conversations with what are potentially our racist relatives about how they treat people of other races, about how they talk about people of other races. This is the time to spread a word that will impose positive impacts and energy into this conversation. This will take more than a campaign and more than a monthly series of conversations to make it a reality. It will take concentrated work to bring and keep us together. And I am so really honored to be a mayor of such an incredible city, a city where I went to school with people of so many different races, where we celebrated our diversity, where we had friends of different races, where we participated in so many programs that helped us to learn and understand not just our differences, but how we are so much also alike. That's what San Francisco is about. That's the San Francisco I know we all want to create. And I know that because of the people that are a part of this town hall today, we are going to get there. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic about the future, and I really want to thank you all so much for participating. So let's get started with the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mayor Breed. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you again to Director Davis and the San Francisco Human Rights Commission for bringing all of us together here for this important town hall. Again, I'm Michelle Meow. I will be serving as your moderator today. And so let's get to it. Remember that this is one of many series, or a few series, that we'll do on this topic and discussion. So we'll try to get to all of your concerns. A little later, we will have a moment for questions, and so get them ready and we'll get to them to our esteemed panel. And so here we are. I'd like to introduce you to our panel today. Eddy Zheng is the president founder of New Breath Foundation and works to mobilize resources to support Asian American and Pacific Islanders, AAPIs, harmed by violence and the unjust immigration and criminal justice systems. We have Reverend Norman Fong, who's a retired executive director of Chinatown CDC, still is one of the pastors at the Presbyterian Church in Chinatown, and he was ordained there in 1981, a former youth pastor of Immigrant Youth Ministries at Cameron House, and a combined total of 42 years as full-time staff at 2 nonprofits in Chinatown. We also have Reverend Arnold Townsend, who's a pillar here in San Francisco, a longtime resident of San Francisco and the Fillmore District, Fillmore neighborhood. He was a member of the Black Student Union at San Francisco State University during the famous student-led strike in the 1960s and was jailed 3 times during the protests. Also served as board president of the African American Art and Culture Complex, which was also run by, as we know, Mayor London Breed. Also vice president of the San Francisco NAACP and an associate minister at Church Without Walls, a Baptist congregation. We have Jon Osaki, who's a native San Franciscan and has served as executive director of JCYC, Japanese Community Youth Council, since 1996. During John's tenure as executive director, JCYC has grown to become one of San Francisco's most successful youth organizations, serving over 5,000 children and youth annually. We also have Monetta White, a native San Franciscan, a career-long community advocate and devoted champion of preserving African-American culture. She's currently the executive director of the Museum of African Diaspora, MOAD, an esteemed Smithsonian affiliate and modern art museum focused on uplifting Black art and culture. So let's welcome our panelists and give a silent round of applause. We'll begin with our first question. Since March of this year, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action have been tracking hate incidents of the Asian American community, reporting over 2,500 incidents, and over 800 of those reports came from California. Now, these numbers are alarming and do not include underreported incidents. And while the tracker may give us the impression anti-Asian discrimination is on the rise, Historical data, facts, policies, and anecdotal information will give us context and prove that this is history repeating itself. So let's begin with some historical information. And so this is a question for any panelists. We'll start with your knowledge of Asian communities here in San Francisco and examples of anti-Asian discrimination leading up to today. We'll begin with Eddy.
Well, happy New Birth, everyone. It's really honor. It's really an honor to share this space with all of you. For me, as someone who is a formerly incarcerated individual who spent 21 years of my life incarcerated as a result of some of those mistakes and those adverse childhood traumas that I had experienced, and not really appreciating all the sacrifices that my parents and my grandparents have made for me to have a better education and better career opportunity. I resorted in harming people, but I'm very grateful that the community and my family had never gave up on me. Reverend Fong can attest to that, because he came to prison and visited me, helped me get free. So understanding that, when we're talking about some of the challenges dealing with the anti-Asian American sentiment that is very re-emerging right now as a result of the foreign policy pushed forth by our current federal administration, it is unacceptable that this is happening again. And I know some of my esteemed panelists will talk a little bit about historical context of some of the challenges that we have experienced. But I do want to talk a little bit about my personal experience in working in the community and how I have witnessed many of the monolingual Chinese and Asian American populations being really targeted in many ways. One, because of their language barriers. Second, because of generation gap and the cultural differences, right? So in a lot of ways that they are targeted just because of the way they look and the language they speak. And so that's regarding policy or regarding how people are looking at people. And I know the way that we always look at many of the Asian Americans, we thinking that we are all fairly sophisticated, smart, and then we are well off in many ways. But I would say that that's only a very small percentage of the people who really work hard and getting their success to the space where they're at. And so, but for many of the other populations, that is contrary to what many of the other people have experienced or understood. And so in that way, I think not only just fiscal attacks, but on the policy level, we have witnessed all this different rhetoric that was disempowering our community. One of the big challenges that we are witness is because of all the coronavirus pandemic rhetoric spewing by the current administration that inspire a lot of hate. And just Michelle, you talked a little bit about some of the numbers earlier, but as of today, nationally, there are 2,738 incidents that's being reported only, right? And in San Francisco alone, there are 282 incidents of violent crimes and hate crimes against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. And so in the Bay Area wide, there's 650 plus incidents happen. And this is not something that has just happened because of COVID, but it's something that has been happening. And I just want to rest there.
Thank you, Eddy. Jon.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'm really grateful to be here, to be part of this conversation. And just what I wanted to contribute to this question is that I think here in San Francisco, we really have a unique role in this conversation about anti-Asian sentiment, because San Francisco, as many on this call I'm sure know, was one of the first ports of entry for Asians in this country, and was really ground zero for some of the anti-Asian sentiment that spread across this country. It was home to the Asiatic Exclusion League in the early 1900s, which promoted a lot of racist laws against Asians here in California. And we even have history of one of our mayors, James Phelan, leading the charge towards the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned all Asians into the United States. So I think that as diverse and inclusive as we think about San Francisco today, we really have this really dark past, and that we really are a symbol of what took place in this country. And frankly, I think has always been there. It hasn't always been politically correct to show it into the last few years, but unfortunately, it's been allowed. People have been emboldened to demonstrate just how much animosity that they have towards Asian Americans. And so I think that what I'm hopeful from today's discussion and moving forward, that we can once again be a model for the rest of the country, but a positive model, a model that sets an example for solidarity and for how we lift up each other as communities going forward.
Thank you, Jon. Reverend Townsend?
Thank you. This is an important conversation for us to have. And I think it's really important that we just, in the beginning, note some things and some issues. Understand that in terms of trying to come together, one of the first things we have to do is really be prepared to change our thinking and the thinking of people we deal with. If you have been raised in this country and educated in this country, it doesn't matter what color you are, you received a racist education. And because of that, we come out of that believing things about one another that are just not true, but yet they drive how we treat one another. And so it's absolutely essential that we begin to change mindsets. The history of Asian racism in this country, and especially in California and San Francisco, is just absolutely amazing and overwhelming. And let me say one thing quickly, Michelle. Just I heard you say that history repeats itself. And I try to stay away from that phrase because it suggests that because history does it, and history is not a person, we can't do much about it. But it's really not true. History doesn't do anything. History is benign. It just sits and waits to be made. What the problem is that people keep on repeating history because there is either a real or perceived advantage for them to repeat the racism of the past and now the racism of the present over and over. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. But it's absolutely essential that we begin to treat each other, or at least educate each other in ways that are important. Understand that most of us live with stereotypes of people that we've been taught. America, this country we call America, which is really, I consider racist in itself since Mexico, Canada, and all the Central and South American countries are in America too. But we've taken a name for ourselves. But in this country, all of us seem to think that we should dictate how people are treated in a way that benefits whatever direction this nation wants to go in. And that's just not the case. I'll just point out to you that so many awful things have happened in modern times. One of the worst, Director Davis mentioned urban renewal, redevelopment in Fillmore. Redevelopment in Fillmore destroyed the traditional Fillmore Black community but it also destroyed the traditional Japanese community, local community in the Fillmore. And it made us more separate and more segregated from one another than the reality was before urban renewal. Because while afterwards we had this place up here where it's Japantown, and the other place down here, which we try not to talk about, the Fillmore. The fact of the matter is, Fillmore and Japantown were interwoven historically and physically before this happened. And so and then the Fillmore community, the Japanese community locally was basically left out because they built a Japan Trade Center, which was a concoction from Japan, and had it by and large left local Japanese out. And later on we get neo-machi and some other things we may get into. But I think it's real important for us to understand that the first thing we have to do is, if we're going to get along, if we're going to move in a direction that we absolutely must move in for survival, we have to begin to dismiss stereotypes and and things that we believe about one another that are absolutely not true and are not beneficial to the narrative. And I hope we'll get into more of that later.
We absolutely will. Thank you so much, Reverend Townsend. Reverend Fong.
Well, Reverend Townsend, thank you for bringing up the J-Town and, Fillmore area conflicts that we've been through together. A lot of folks who are new to San Francisco really don't know the history. There were Japanese Americans in the Fillmore and even the Bayview who were removed, and a lot of African Americans from the South came up. So that's important, though, just to understand it, and you know it all. Because the mayor and you and others covered the stuff I wrote down, I'm going to take it a different direction. So for you young folks out there, young Asian Americans especially listening, picture this. Okay, I grew up in the 50s. Yeah, I'm old. And I went to school in Chinatown, and all the teachers were white. No Asian cops or politicians or anything. So the world was pretty white back then, but it was okay because we had each other in Chinatown. We didn't know we were segregated. We didn't know what segregation was. We just grew up that way. I crossed over to North Beach, the Italian neighborhood, to go to junior high. I got tied to a fence, and these kids that didn't know me at all, I didn't know them, they water balloon tortured me. And then later they beat me up and knifed me and all that stuff. I faced racism, okay? This is early 60s maybe. So, all right, a lot of us don't experience that today or don't understand it. So we don't understand the history of racism even in our own great city of San Francisco. I was motivated, I'm gonna cut it short now, when I heard about Vincent Chen, and everyone should know that story. 1982, he got baseball batted to death because people were mad at Japan for taking away car jobs, auto jobs, and he was Chinese. His mom came to Chinatown, San Francisco, and we organized like crazy, but we didn't have social media then or anything like that. So I was feeling hopeless. I wanted to fight for it. Dang it, stop this hate and beating on Asians, right? You can feel me now, right? I hope you do. We needed help. The Chinese community across the country wasn't that big. So somebody big and powerful stepped in, and I'll love him forever. I don't care what anyone says about Reverend Jesse Jackson. He came to Chinatown to stand with Vincent Chen's mom, and we organized. It was a big movement, Asian American movement across the country about dealing with racism. So I'm saying that because of our theme today, Stand Together. I know that a lot of us in Chinatown, I've been working there my whole life. My mom was working here the whole life. My family's been a part of Chinatown, San Francisco for 100-something years. So I know the history. I've been there. And those of you on Facebook who think we're just representing, I forgot, I saw some Facebook. This is the real stuff, all right? Racism has been a part of America. It's institutionalized. And they be messing with the Asian community sometimes, and then other times they say we're the model minority. They're using us, okay? The fact is we are being hated on the national level. I thank God for Speaker Pelosi, who came last Thursday to San Francisco to talk to us and tell us we got a problem nationally. The hate rhetoric against us now, the same rhetoric against Blacks, the same rhetoric against Latinos. We need to pull it together and understand. So from a personal level, I'm just sharing with you, it's been a part of our history, not repeating itself. It's the same monster that shows up every now and then. And right now, we got to organize. San Francisco, I expect us to do a good job of making that solidarity real. There are Asian seniors, I've buried a few, seniors beat up by Blacks or other groups attacking each other. And there's a tendency to get ugly again and blame each racial group. We're just being used, all right? Understand the big picture. You got to understand the big picture. And in San Francisco, I hope that we can get it done right. And thank you, no thanks to Trump, who helps make it national and big and seems to legitimize these white racists. I mean, this is terrible. So I could talk too much, but I'll stop for now.
We will pick up on that in the second question in terms of being used and what's causing the divide and the racial tension. But Monetta, would love your thoughts in terms of historical context, anti-Asian discrimination, and what's happened leading up to what's happening now.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. And I want to thank Sheryl and the mayor for putting this on today. I'm personally passionate about this topic because, we both have stories, and I agree with everybody what they were saying today. It's about understanding and sharing and learning about ourselves and each other's cultures. For me, this is what makes San Francisco special. As a native San Franciscan, I've grown up with mixed cultures and have broadened my knowledge about all the things I've learned from food and music and dance and religion. And this city of San Francisco wouldn't be the world-renowned city it is today without the Black and Asian communities that make up the tapestry of the city. And for me, when I think of historical and the theme of today, which is stand together, in the 1960s, the slogan "Yellow Perel supports Black Power" was a call from the Asian community to support the Black community at the center of this civil rights movement. And while those issues and historic treatments is not the same for both communities, that sort of solidarity is important. And so today, I'm proud when I see that we're coming together as a community and saying that this is zero tolerance. We will not have this. And so I'm just happy to be amongst, everyone here today to be having this discussion and continue the work that we have to do. And because I agree, we have hard conversations, but this is our city and we cannot allow it.
Thank you so much, Monetta. So before we even discuss ideas of solutions or what we do or how we build allyship and equity for our communities, I think it's also really important to, address the reasons why. So I'd like to pick up from, Reverend Fong, what you said in giving some examples of how we are being used, how the racial tension causes the divide that can lead to incidents of harassment or violence or anti-Asian discrimination. And so let's head to Jon, and then we'll come back to Norman Fong if you wanted to add more to what you had said earlier. Jon?
Sure, thank you, Michelle. And I certainly will allow or would love Reverend Townsend to expand on this because he lived through it. But I've been personally reflecting a lot on what created my organization, JCYC. And it was really young people who were part of the student strikes in 1968, who experienced solidarity between the Black students and the Latinx students. And it was that energy and that power of solidarity that eventually created my organization. And I think that, you know, if we're thinking about historical examples, I think, you know, in my own research lately, when I'm reflecting on this era, I think we have to think about the white power structures that were around during that time that witnessed the power of communities of colors working together. Some of you may recall that at that time, the governor of California was Ronald Reagan. And he did not appreciate the strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. He did not like to bow down to the power of people calling for ethnic studies and recognition of their ethnic heritages in schools. And he remembered how powerful that was when these communities came together. And so when he became president, you know, as president of the United States, he very intentionally attempted to drive a wedge between Blacks and Asians by lifting up Asians and using the model minority myth to divide us. And I think part of the challenge moving ahead is that, and you know, Reverend Townsend spoke of it beautifully, is that in many ways it worked. That many in our communities were conditioned to believe those stereotypes, to believe that all Asians were well off, were doing fine, and it's been incredibly damaging. And I think that's part of what we have to talk about to each other, is that there have been, and you know, Reverend Fong could talk about this as well. There's been so many families who have been left behind because of that narrative, who have been ignored, that have critical issues that even today are affecting API families that don't make the news, seldom get talked about, because we've been conditioned to believe this narrative that has been perpetuated, not by us, and to be honest, not by the Black community, but by the white power structure. And that we have to recognize that this was done to us very intentionally. And as Reverend Fong said, we have been used. And I think we have to start to confront this issue because, you know, unfortunately, there are members of our community who have bought into this. And it has been damaging in efforts to maintain solidarity between our communities. So I think that we have to have honest conversations, because too often we fall into the trap of, you know, this perception that one community's gain is the other community's loss. And that is a losing perception for both of our communities. And we have to get back to talking about how we protect each other, how do we get our piece of the pie, but how do we grow it for everybody? How do we make sure the needs of each community is taken care of? And we have to get back to those kind of conversations. And I just want to, you know, conclude my thoughts by saying, you know, when I was growing up in Japantown, there was a gentleman who I met when I turned 18 years old named Tamatra Scott. And I happened to be with him the day I turned 18. And the first thing he did was, when he found out that I had turned 18, he stuck a voter registration application in my hand. And he gave me the finger like this. He came over here and he said, fill it out right now. And he, you know, I've been thinking a lot about him lately, because something that I really admired about him is that he absolutely was an advocate for the Black community, but he also understood the power of our communities working together. And I think that's a lesson that I never forgot. It's something that we believe in very passionately at JCYC, and something that I think we have to be more intentional about in the city moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Reverend Fong, anything to add to previous comments and to John's comments?
Okay, I agree. We need to pay homage to Reverend Townsend for being older. I was there at the Third World Strike in SF State too, but I was a young kid there. The cops pushed me, and well, anyway, let's go there. But there was solidarity there. I love it. Because there's people that want to deal with the current situation of anti-Asian hate. I'm going to let Reverend Townsend cover that side of that history. Right now, I got a problem. When grandmas get beat up and there's hate on the youth level, and we don't know what to say or do because we support civil rights and the solidarity. So I'm cutting to the chase here. And I get messages too. How do we deal with the current situation, not just of Trump, but inter-ethnic trust? Like John and I and Townsend, we all have been through it together, so we trust each other, all right? We've been through it. I've been arrested for 209, I've been arrested for civil, so there's long history there. But newcomers, right here, a senior gets beat up, she's 89. Mrs. Yee killed in Viz Valley for no apparent reason. There's a hate that's going on that we have to address too, not just COVID. So I really hope, and I know we can't do it now, but I've been through this, in the 1980s, it was the Vietnamese that got beat up. I had to go to the hospital because my kids from Viz Valley were stabbed, going to Philip Burton. I mean, I've been 2010 when there was a one punch thing where, a lot of gangs wanted to just beat up on the Asian just for fun to prove their whatever. I mean, there's real stuff going on. Today, a lot of the seniors in San Francisco, Asians especially, are picked on for economic reasons or whatever, right? Easy prey, that's what I've been told. But I'm getting a little sick and tired of some of this. I hope that the Human Rights Commission and our meeting today will lead to a few concrete things. In 2010, what we ended up with is two things. One was community ambassadors, so they won't knock over the Asians on the 3rd Street light rail again or get punched out and killed. I appreciated Reverend Townsend, Amos Brown, and others who joined me in doing these services out there in the Bayview to stop the violence. However, it's not enough. We got to go deeper, and we've got to learn from the past. When we did the 1992 Rodney King rally in Chinatown, talk about solidarity. We've been doing it all along, all our history. But I remember I wanted to go down to LA and learn directly from the Black leadership and Korean leadership there. It was bad. Koreans, Blacks, the Korean store owner killing a Black young woman, and it was bad. They said, and they taught me then, never stand alone. Do it together. It's not just Black Lives Matter. It's Black Lives Matter and Asian Lives Matter. You say it together and you look unified. So recently this year, we had our Black Lives Matter rally in Chinatown, and we linked it to Vincent Chen. We linked it together. So there's solidarity. So whenever there's moments of solidarity, we got to do more of it in San Francisco. Like this weekend will be in LA, they celebrate the massacre of the Chinese in Chinatown there in 1871. We need to find those moments and issues of solidarity. I really want that. And the second thing, I can't forget the youth. John, you've taught me this. Listen to the youth. In 2010, when they saw all the violence, it was bad, man. Oakland here. And what happened was the youth said, I shut up for once and let the youth speak. And they said, what we need is ethnic studies in high school. And so Jane Kim and our youth organized with Black youth too, to create ethnic studies in 5 high schools. We need to make it more universal. We got to understand each other's history more. And finally, I'm talking too long, I know. One more thing. My friend in the, invited me to take on a Chinatown tour these gang members, all black, tough looking youth. They could have kicked my butt. But anyway, I took them into a Chinatown SRO and they saw the poverty. So I said, don't believe in that Asian model myth, model minority. They saw, and the one thing they said, they were from Sunnydale projects. They go, well, at least in Sunnydale, we have our own toilets, because they saw the poverty. We don't have individual toilets. We don't have individual kitchens, or, Chinatown is so jam-packed, they have to share everything. And it's really, but that, I bet you those kids will never beat on an Asian. I know it because they saw it. They know what we're going through too. True solidarity. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Reverend Fong. And Eddy, wanted to get your thoughts on that question. And it's what we're looking for are some examples. What we started with of the racial tension that can lead to the divide and also the violence. You have specific experiences, especially around the criminal justice system. And so would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. There's just so much to run through. We can talk about this all day and all week, right? I mean, looking at the historical impact of some of the challenges with the Asian American communities, the obvious thing that when we're looking at for people is that how do we understand our history and our culture to inform our values, right? So that's why I always try to promote how do we tap into our chi, right? And the chi that I'm talking about is not only the life force or the breath that is sustaining us, but really is culture, history, and identity. And for me, to understand that, I have to be able to understand historically there's discrimination that happened in the Chinese community, and then as well as in many other communities. But because as part of the theme of standing together, and but it's also about uniting against Asian hate, right? Is that I want to really uplift the victims, right? That who are suffering, that who is right now in your face, right? The victims of violence in our Chinese community, in the Asian American community in San Francisco, right? It's in our face. So when it's in our face, and when elderly and their family members and people seeing that in our face, the outrage, the hurt, the pain, and the hopelessness of nothing is being done to protect their personal safety, right? That is real. And I highlight that because I don't want us to forget why are we here, right? So, and that's one thing. The second thing, I had a little talk with Reverend Townsend, maybe like a couple years ago, right? When we were in Fillmore, we were in this little cafe. And one of the things that always stuck in my mind, what Reverend Townsend shared with me was that he asked me this question. He said, Eddy, do you know what is the best export from the United States or from the Europeans? I'm like, what is that?
Yeah.
He said, racism. Racism was the best export for the Europeans to continue to disempower us and to divide us. And hence, when we look at what's happening right now in the Chinese community and the Asian American community, it is outrageous. And we cannot just stand by and just be idle and saying that, well, that's too bad. It doesn't happen to our community, so it's too bad. Well, it happens to every community, right? And anti-Blackness is real from the export of institutional racism. So I want to highlight that first, right? Let me talk about some of the solidarity building that we have experienced in our community, right? For 10 years, Reverend Fong, CCDC and Community Youth Center and the Baby YMCA, we started the celebration of Black History Month and Lunar Year celebration, 10 years in a row. It's about bringing people together, to deepening relationship. How do we build relationship with each other? We started the Baby Solidarity Tour with Tracy Zhu, right? That we happen in the Baby, where we bring elderly monolingual Chinese immigrants to get on this tour about a baby, about Hunters Point that they've been living in, right? About the gardens, about the shipyard. about the shrimp farmers, the Chinese shrimp farmers that have been in the Indian Basin since 1939. We educate the monolingual seniors so they know that they belong in this community. They're part of this community, right? And we're talking about how the World War II has impacted the African-American community, the redlining about housing. We talk about the racist policies, right, that impacted them. So that's another aspect of how we can look at that to have, how do we come together, right? The other piece I want to talk a little bit about some of the solidarity work that's been working is that we have worked with people in the African-American community to do violence prevention, with the Latin community doing violence prevention for years, right? So, but then there's still, because of this model minority, they think that Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, we don't need those type of services and resources, right? Because they think that we're better than the other minority groups, which is another disempowering tool to separate us. And so when we look at historically, we look at the Red Guards in 1969, when it's formed in San Francisco, Chinatown, inspired by the Black Panthers Party, fight for self-determination, fight for our people. We talk about the IWK, Yi Wo Kuen, that subsequently started in 1969 in New York, doing the same thing. We talk about Yuri Kochiyama, who cradled Malcolm X in the Audubon Ballroom as he inhaled his last breath when he was assassinated. We talk about Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit, who married James Boggs, who really up there. We're talking about collaboration with African American and the Chinese community. You know, we talk about Richard Aoki, who is the Black Panthers field marshal, right, in 1965, 69, out of Laney College. Again and again, we have so many people that are coming together to talk about this and addressing this. But for me, as someone who's been to film roles in many of the African American families, many of the Latin families, I've been to a lot of film roles for the Chinese American community, right? And time again, I'm sharing with people, we need to address systemic issues and not continue to talk about, well, these people are attacking the Chinese community. What are we going to do about it? Instead of looking at like, why are these people attacking the Chinese elders and Chinese community? What causes that? And then when we start to understand that we know that the white supremacy and the export of institutional racism is the root cause of disempowering and hurting our community. And lastly, I just want to say, when we're talking about being discriminated or attacked, you can never separate the indigenous people of this land who has their land taken from them. You can never separate the enslavement of the African-American community who was brought to this country and enslaved for generations. We cannot separate the attack on Chinese American, Asian American from those two things. And if we do, we will continue to lose.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eddy. And thank you to all of the participants who are sending us questions. We're getting a few questions, and so I think I'm going to jump to our audience questions a little early just so that we have time. And a lot of the questions are, we're sharing the same concerns anyway. And so here's a comment. I appreciate that we're all in this together. Please discuss plans for racial equity and the model of scarcity that continues to fuel anti-Asian and anti-Black sentiments in our community. We want to talk about allyship. We want to talk about equity. We want to talk about the solutions. Let's begin with Reverend Townsend.
Yeah, I'm glad this is a good time. Let me say, much of what is going on, I charge us for much of what is going on, and it's up to us to fix it, because we all realize that those who make this racism happen, the folks who benefit from it, are not going to fix it. They have no interest and no reason to. Let me say this at the beginning. Please keep in mind that y'all are only the model minorities when we're around. When we're not around, y'all become the N-word. And then when we show up, you're the model minority again. And that's how they keep the friction going. So please keep that in mind. Let me tell you one of the things. I alluded to this earlier. It's about education. And it's about us understanding that to break the hold that the racist, this racist nation, its educational system has on us. We've got to start educating our children because they're not learning what all they need to know in school. They can be a straight A student, Black or Asian, but they're not learning what they need to know to be Black or Asian in a racist society. Who's teaching that? And why would we expect the people who are misteaching them to teach that? And until we take the responsibility of our children's, especially race education, in our hands, we'll never save them. We won't even save this nation. So we've got to change our perspective on what our role and what our job is. Our job is not just to state the problem, which we've done eloquently in this Zoom call, and there are probably 100 Zoom calls all over the nation just today, where we're stating the problem, but we're not dealing with what kind of actions we need to take. We need to look at working with the Human Rights Commission and other private foundations and organizations. How do we start educating our children? What Eddy was talking about is that the first propaganda of this nation was racism. They had to convince the rest of the nation and the world that Black people were worthy of slavery, and that's all. They had to convince the world that the Chinese were worthy of being coolies and working their hearts out and not being fairly compensated because that's all they deserve. And we may not buy, if you're Asian, you may not buy into that for yourself, but because of the education, you can buy into it for Black people. Even an Asian man saying once, Black people in print deserve to be slaves because they didn't fight back, which shows a total lack of history of slavery. And so, but that's because he probably made that up in his own mind, or heard his daddy or the drunk uncle at Thanksgiving say it, but there's no education to counter it. So beginning to change the mindset of people is the only thing that's going to ultimately make us successful. We are in bad shape when it comes to our young people. And even when we were having issues before, we talked about young people, as Norman talked about, going to Chinatown and sitting in classes and learning history. But they got to come to Fillmore and Hunters Point too. Chinese kids have to come over there too and find out even that our history may be because of China. Chinese kids can reflect on, or Japan or Vietnam can reflect on a glorious history that is put before them. We, in our children in the Black community, they have a glorious history too that nobody teaches them or teaches y'all, that we never talk about. So if those kids are gonna go there, if our kids are gonna go to Chinatown, Japantown, those children have to come to our community and get an education on who we are and what we're about, and most importantly, seeing above all that we live in so many of the same conditions, working hard for freedoms that white people are born with. See, when you have to pass a law to give me the rights that you are born with, then we know that there's a major struggle on our hands to ever be in anybody's eyes equal, including our own. So I am, there's a whole lot of other things I want to say, but I want to leave this here, that we start to talk about how do we correct, first of all, within our own youth, the mindset of who we are to each other, but also who we are to ourselves. I'll close with this. A young man, a friend of mine introduced him to me. She's Chinese. He's Chinese, but he was a recent immigrant, and she'd been here for 50 years or more. And we were helping him because he was having problems with his neighbors and trying to do some work on the house he just bought. And I was explaining to him that one of the problems is you come over here from China, man, and you move in the middle of all these white folk, and you buy the biggest house on the block that they all wanted and couldn't afford. Yeah, they don't like you because you're Chinese. No, Reverend, I don't think that's it at all. No. Well, we dealt with him for about a year. And finally, he met with them when I wasn't around. And when he came out of the meeting, he told me about the meeting. He said, you know what, Reverend? I think they don't like me because I'm Chinese. I said, welcome to America. You finally immigrated. It took you 11 years after you got here to really be an immigrant. And now you're on your way to being an American because you understand, you're beginning to understand where you live and that people will murder you and lynch you based upon a belief, Vincent Chen, on a belief that's not true. One, he wasn't even Japanese. Two, think of the mindset that you have to have as a white American to say that the Japanese in their own country don't have a right to build cars. And because your ancestors came from that country, we have a right to kill you. And y'all think our most important job is not teaching our kids about propaganda and race hate and how it affects us and makes us all who are the victims of it turn around and take it out on each other. We've got to move and we've got to start taking some concrete actions. We've got to move our discussion on race from complaint to cure. And if we can do that, complaint to change, if we can do that, we will have done more than a whole lot of other people have ever thought about doing in their life. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Reverend Townsend. Monetta, this would be also a great question for you. Lots of questions coming in from our audience and saying the same in terms of what Reverend Townsend had said. We need education. We need to reach the youth, the different generations, and do much more outreach. For someone like you who preserves culture, an activist and advocate, and brings arts and culture together, your thoughts on how we get the education out there?
Yes, thank you. I want to agree with everything that has been said. You know, I feel like I'm at church, Reverend Townsend, you're preaching between you and Norman and Eddie. I mean, this is just fantastic. It's really even hard to add, but you're right. It is about education, and changing the narrative starts with exposure to each other's cultures. Hate comes from ignorance, and it takes both sides in making effort to learn more and experience each other's cultures to take us out of the ignorance on both sides. Museums and other cultural institutions are a great place to start with that. I think someone said multiple communities are, you know, in similar situations but can't see each other. In order to see each other, we first need to hear each other. And to hear each other, we must practice active listening. We need to do our best to listen more than we talk. And when we do talk, we need to talk with each other and not at each other. We have to begin to start taking action. You know, you talked about, you know, how do we, you know, be good allies in this? Well, we have to acknowledge our blind spots and read and listen and study our racial histories and the inequitable treatment of our community. I mean, the bottom line is we have to take care of each other. So I just feel that, you know, we just, again, you know, we have to, I love Reverend Townsend, what did you say? From challenges to cure and to change. I think that's what we have to start, you know, doing. So thank you.
Here's a question maybe for Reverend Fong. Due to the huge digital divide, language barriers, and et cetera, in large immigration districts, or I'm sorry, large immigrant districts, and especially for seniors and the monolingual populations, how can residents be properly outreach and informed so they can provide needed input at all times?
I love that question. One of the joys I have of being in Chinatown all my life is seeing these seniors on a computer. we create these, you know, computer lounges, and young people come to help educate them to get on board. but I'm going to cheat a little bit and switch it a little. The census is going on, and getting our SRO families and our seniors to learn just to be counted, you know, that's beautiful. And one more thing, bridging from where Reverend Townsend was coming to the cure and practicality. Did you know that there are African-American families in Chinatown? All right.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I know, everybody. So we took over the public housing, and we are trying to build the beloved community there. We don't get no funding for that. I mean, everyone wants to talk about the education on a higher level, but where we could influence the Black leaders in the Pingyuan public housing, for example, we got a Black women's leadership group. They can help educate too other African Americans and the Chinese community on the history. So I mean, it's like, that's a real beloved community possibility right there. We need in San Francisco to find those opportunities. You know, I don't know how we spend our money. I don't know how funding is allocated in the city across the board and everywhere, but we got to be smarter, strategic, and put our money where the best beloved communities can be born.
Norman, Michelle, excuse me real quick. Norman, I appreciate that, because one of the things we've got to be careful to do, not to create or allow others to create a false narrative for us. There are problems without question. There are terrible problems. But I've been living in San Francisco 53 years. And from the damn near the first month I was here, I knew people who lived in, Black folk who lived in Chinatown, and not all in the Pingyuan. I knew, and see, while at the same time we got these problems, we've got other things that make those problems alive. You have every day thousands of interactions in this town that go on between Chinese and African Americans that are cordial in nature. Those relationships that we have, let's face it, they are business relationships. I do business with Chinese folk. They are not only business relationships, they are collegial and friendly relationships. They are spiritual relationships. And yes, they are romantic relationships, because if you stand at a bus stop and see the babies, they come out of Chinatown on their way to school. They might all be Chinese, but they don't all look Chinese. Some of them look just like me. So we have these positive relationships we've got to constantly fall back on and point to as the way that our communities really interact, and that when there are problems, they are an aberration brought on by lack of understanding and education. So I just wanted us to point out, let's don't build something. I don't want to take a truth and make it a lie. Go ahead, I'm sorry about that.
No, don't be sorry, don't apologize. Oh. And yeah, please jump in if you have more to add. What are the city's realistic, substantial, and ongoing commitments to stop anti-Asian discrimination and crimes? And anyone can take this up, but maybe Jon or Eddy. Jon?
Well, I think that, you know, part of what we have to create are places that we can have the hard conversations. What we're doing here today is really important. It's really important to have these types of dialogues, but there are also much more difficult conversations that have to occur between groups. And, you know, we don't, you know, it's uncomfortable. We don't always have, make time or have a place to do that. But I think that part of addressing the violence that's occurring against Asians is that, you know, as a community, we have to find ways to stand up for other communities, to call out anti-Blackness, and issues that occur and are of concern with other communities. And the hope in that type of exchange is that then other communities will stand up for us, and that there will be a way for us to call out things that occur within our own communities. And I think that's part of the work that's ahead of us. I know that, you know, when one of the things that used to take place in the Western Addition is that when there were crimes committed against some of the Japanese seniors in our area, there was a group, a Black-led group that would provide escorts, who would be allies to those people to ensure they're safe. And I think that we need to get back to some of those strategies, some very visible strategies where we can demonstrate support for each other. And I think that, you know, as a community, we are struggling a little bit to find out, you know, where do we fit in the conversation around equity in the city. And I think, you know, part of what we hope going forward is that, and, you know, what's been a challenge is, you know, we have tried to raise issues of concern in the past, and it hasn't always been met with, you know, a lot of concern. You know, a few years ago, we brought up, you know, real concerns around the growing number of poor Asians here in San Francisco, poor Asian families that Reverend Fong was talking about, and no alarms went off. There was no urgency around some of the data that came out, which showed that almost half of all the poor families in San Francisco are now Asian. And so I think we need a place to be able to bring those types of concerns and talk through how we can get support from each other. And on our side, we need to find out how we can support other communities. You know, as a Japanese American, I would love to be involved in conversations about how I can support reparations for the Black community. We don't have a place to have that conversation right now, and I would love to be an ally in that process. And I think that, of course, we're, you know, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think we would like to know more about how we can be allies and supportive of that process. And so I think that finding a way where we can share and talk through the real critical needs that each of our communities are facing, I think will help a lot and will help promote allyship. And I think part of what we have to be able to do is here in San Francisco is be a model for the rest of the nation, that we have to show a very visible way that we are working together, that we are supporting each other, that we are not dismissing each other's needs, and that we are calling out the issues within our own communities that break down and work against the type of solidarity that we need to really build our power base and our structure as communities of color.
Michelle,
yeah, Eddie, and I want to get to, we got about 15 minutes or so left before our program ends. And I wish that it was actually longer, but you know, Eddie, add to the question also a couple comments from our audience here is, you know, part of the solution. What do we do? Is it community organizing? We heard education and outreach, bridging the youth and our elders, and cultural education. But what about even examples of organizations like the San Francisco Peace Collective? You know, should we mobilize in this way, or is it all of it, or is it add more, you know, foot patrol of police officers in our communities and neighborhoods? I think that was a big question that people want to ask. So you get the lucky opportunity to address all of it.
Thank you, and I can talk about it. I can talk about it all day. However, because the time's sake, I want to address some of those questions that you asked. I mean, but I do want to say, you know, given what Jon was sharing earlier, you know, the report that Jon was talking about was from the API Council in San Francisco, right? Which really is saying that the Asian Pacific Americans in San Francisco accounts for 32% of the population, but they make up 42% of the low-income population. But people don't know that. If you look at the model minority myth and trying to look at that to project in the API community, it's false. So that's one thing. The second thing is, we're talking about what the city, you know, the question is what the city can do. Well, I'm very disappointed in the city. right? Because the city has not really invested in resources in address this type of inequities in the African American community, in the Latin community, and definitely not address it in the Chinese community or the Samoan community with the represent Asian Pacific Islanders. And we haven't even talked about the Southeast Asian refugees and other refugees that who came into the city, right? So even though we are a sanctuary city, but just looking at all this violence that's happening in the Chinese community, I'm just saying that because that's the topic. I already know about the African American community and other communities. I'm just focusing on that because the majority of the people who are impacted, who may not be educated or who may not have those type of analysis, political analysis, what they were saying that, what are you doing about the Blacks attacking the Chinese, attacking the Asians? Why are you not addressing that? Always talking about systemic racism and all this stuff. Well, you know, unfortunately, we need people to step up, just like I'm stepping up, just like many other people in the Asian American community step up to saying that Black lives matter. And if Black lives don't matter, then none of our lives matter. I want the same from the other community and the Black community leadership to saying that this is unacceptable and these people need to be held accountable. We need to support in violence prevention by investing in our education instead of the prison industrial complex or the military industrial complex. And so we have to have the concrete solutions. The community ambassador program in 2010 that we pushed the city to start it, right? It's been 10 years. I share a picture with all of you. 10 years ago, Mayor Bree, before she was a mayor, right? Jane Kim, Latifah Simon, who was the ED at the time for the Lawrence Community for Civil Rights. Now she's the president at the Arcanati Foundation, and Kendra Fox and Vincent Chen. We all came together to address this issue, right? Reverend Fong and I, we let this 1,000 people rally in City Hall to address the issue. Has anything changed? Nothing. It's still happening. So now, what are we going to do on the city level? I need the city leaders to figure that one out. But on a community level, we have to dip in our relationships. We have to educate our young people, investing in young people. We have to address anti-Blackness. And we have to come up with solutions that is not racial profiling against the Blacks. Many of the groups that come together, they have great intentions, right? Yes, we want to protect Chinatown. We want to protect Japantown. We want to protect this town, that town. Well, it's all about this town. I don't care about all the rest of the town. Let me protect this town. And protect against whom? So visibly, because the conditioning of racism, anti-Blackness, we're saying that the Black people are attacking us. So we have to protect us against the Blacks, right? So what do? We see any Blacks, whether you are a tourist, whether you are a resident in Chinatown, racial profile them. Oh, 5 young people are walking in Chinatown. Let's get ready to call the cops. This person stole a pants because that's a homeless individual, has mental health issues. Let's call the police. I call that racial profiling. So great intentions. Yes, we need to protect our merchants. We need to protect our elders. We need to protect people from being attacked. But then we also need resources. We need the people who saying all of that stuff to really come about to do the same, have the same passion about the racism that is happening in the African American community and other community of color. Until that happens, it's always going to be, when we have this town hall right here, the comment would be, what about anti-Blackness? How about nobody's talking about anti-Blackness? And then when we talk about anti-Blackness, the Chinese and Asians say, oh, how come nobody talks about attacks on the Chinese? Who wins? None of us wins. It's the people that continue to play the puppet role. Those people are winning, not us. So we have to dip in our relationships. And lastly, I just want to say this, right? Because I really want Monetta to really put a context into some of the solutions, right, from our community. What can education, history, and culture can do for all of us, right? So I always say this, we must be willing to engage in a personal revolution before we are able to embark on a collective revolution.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eddy. And we got about 3 minutes left, and I want to give a chance to the rest of our panelists to add your final thoughts. Last question I really loved is, okay, well, we talked about the people in power. We talked about the racist structures that have been kept in place. It's not history repeating itself, but the behaviors, happening again, and we have to change that. And one of the questions points to funding. One of the questions points to getting rid of this power. I'm going to head to Reverend Fong and then Reverend Townsend, and then anybody else who wants to add for the rest of the time, if you would like to offer your final thoughts touching on that.
Sorry.
Oh, Monetta, sorry. Go ahead, Monetta, and then we'll go to Reverend Fong.
No. Because I know Reverend Fong and Reverend Townsend is going to leave us on a high spirit with their energy. So you should end on them for sure. But in closing for me, I just wanted to say that I do, and I keep saying this over and over again, because I do know that understanding is the key to resolving most conflicts. Understanding ourselves is the first step to understanding others. I know at MOAD and the Asian Art Museum, we focus on telling our stories. That's educating, celebrating what makes us human through art and our culture. It's so important to remember that an injustice to one is an injustice to all. Even as people of color, we can hurt each other. Sometimes we get caught up in our own struggles and get in a bit of a tunnel vision. But in reality, we need to do the work together to overcome issues that may be unique to our own experiences. And that's what I wanted to end on. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Monetta. Quickly, Jon, before we get to both the reverends.
I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Thank you for having me. I just really want to emphasize that we have so much more power together than we do apart. And I look forward to working with everybody on this panel, people who are part of this call today, to really figure out how we take our power back collectively as communities.
Reverend Fong.
So I remember there was a wedge between the Latino community and the Chinese community. I have a town hall every month. Almost 1,000 of Chinatown residents show up. I brought in an undocumented Latino from the mission to just tell the story. And let me tell you, hearts and minds were changed. And I still believe in that. I'm not sure if a lot of people in Chinatown feel that other communities are listening to them right now. Why pick on us? Why is, anti-immigrant xenophobia? And so I hope we can't change the whole world, but everyone listening and everyone here can do a lot more. I don't know what the Human Rights Commission can do. That's my number one question is, okay, we agreed to be on this panel. I want to see some action, concrete action. I'll stop there. Preach on, Reverend Townsend.
Yes, leave us on a high note. We've run out of time, but I think everyone will be okay with your last parting words.
Reverend Townsend?
It looks like you're on mute, Reverend.
I don't know how that happens. We're in a situation where our focus today has been on each other. And the problem is, there's a story of a young fella is standing at the riverbank and he keeps trying to get some water, but the water he keeps reaching for is dirty. And he can't drink it, but he keeps trying to get it. And finally, an old man comes along and says, son, if you would go up a couple of steps and get that hog that's in the water out, the water might be dirty. We have sat and talked about each other looking for clean water, but we haven't really talked about how we're going to deal with the hog that's dirty in our stream. And that's the powers that control us in this country, whatever you want to call them, white folk, whatever you want to call them. There is an issues that we've got to correct. And one of the first things we've got to do is we've got to start correcting the illnesses in our own community. The illnesses in the Black community of how they perceive Asian people, sure, but also the illnesses in the Asian community on how they perceive us. That I know when I'm damn near 80 years old and looking, and I get on the elevator in a suit and tie with an Asian woman, and the first thing she does is look at me and get a death grip on her purse. That's the mindset that we've got to work to correct and realize that these issues have been created for us. Because as long as we have these issues between us, we cannot change the issues that confront us. And Norman, I disagree. We can change the world. And the world ain't gonna get changed unless we do it. And we can't do it unless we get started in that small corner that we occupy and decide today that whenever the Lord calls me home, that corner I occupy is gonna be better for me having been there than if I hadn't been there. And that goes for my relationship with Asian folk, Latino folk, white folk, and Black folk. We've got to get a new mindset that only us, we're the only ones that are going to change the conditions that our people face collectively. Thank you all so much. It's a great panel. Let's don't stop talking, but as we continue to talk, let's start planning and above all, designing the solution that's going to get us out of where we are.
That's right, Reverend. And that was the whole point of the kickoff of these series. Remember, there are a few more, there are a ton more. We're going to keep going. We're going to get to those solutions. And so thanks so much for having all of us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Brittany to close for us, Chief of Staff for San Francisco Human Rights Commission.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I just want to say and echo you in thanking all of the panelists. So thank you, Michelle, so much for moderating and facilitating this conversation. It was really amazing just to be a witness and participate. But thank you to Eddy, Reverend Fong, Reverend Townsend, Monetta, and Jon for sharing your narratives and your heartfelt about what you have experienced and also what we're moving towards, how we're moving forward. I think that ending on an uplifting and hopeful note is really all that we could ask for. So I'm just filled with gratitude for everything that you shared and inspired in us today. I wanted to reflect on a couple things really quickly. One, something that Reverend Fong said that really resonated with me was this history of promoting racist laws in San Francisco, because as he was saying, a lot of us come here, or a lot of our ancestors came to San Francisco as refugees. You know, regardless of the country or state we were traveling from, speaking from personal experience, my family came here from the South because they were fleeing white terrorism, right? And a lot of people are fleeing terror from their homeland, wherever that may be, domestic or abroad. And I think that that's something that definitely binds us. But it's important to remember, again, that the promotion of racist laws in San Francisco has been universal for anyone who was not white. Whether you're Asian, Black, Latinx, Native American, there has just been a history that we are still course correcting for of targeted and legalized racism. And so I think I just wanted to echo what our panelists said, in that there's so much more that connects us than tears us apart. And that attacking each other is really only doing the bidding and the work of white supremacy, right? And I'm reading this really amazing book that I wanted to share with everyone. It's called Cast. You can see my bookmarks are in it, by Isabel Wilkerson. And it's really touching on something that Eddy spoke about, which is the ways in which the United States exported race, racism, the ways in which our differences have been, codified legally to divide us. And I think that, COVID has only served as a reminder of all of the brokenness and cracks in our society and our communities. And it's really busted those those issues wide open. It exploited those differences, right? It's exploited those divisions that have been fomented really by white supremacy, by xenophobia, by misunderstanding one another, by anti-immigrant sentiment. So it's important, again, that we just come back home and remember that there's more that we can build together with a united front than sitting over here in our corners with our crumbs. We can eat a full meal if we bring it all to the table. So in closing, I just want to share a couple things because there were some comments in the chat, and I'm so sorry we have so many amazing community leaders on the call. I saw Reverend Brown out there. I saw Queen Vanessa Banks. I saw Commissioner Hala Hijazi, Commissioner Irene Yee Riley, Commissioner Melanie Ampon. Thank you all for being on the call. I wish that we had an opportunity to hear from all of you because, and I know that there are so many more out there that we didn't hear from today. But you know, a sentiment that I saw in a few of the chat comments was, how do we move forward? You know, we have had these conversations before. We know that these issues exist and persist, but what is different about this? And so we're really calling you all to action to work with us to make sure that this is not a one-off. The Human Rights Commission is happy to be a convener in this, but we really want this to be a community-led response to ensure that we are responding to, you know, anyone in the city who feels invisibilized, targeted, unsafe. It's unacceptable. And we want to be that uniting place where we can have these conversations, but also move forward in action on a lot of the exciting and innovative ideas that were shared in the chat, whether it's creating better resources for our young people outside of schools, or just creating more spaces like this where we're gathering in conversation to elevate different community needs. So we wanted to share this website that we've created, and really big gratitude to Director Davis for spearheading this and creating our Stand Together SF website. We'll put the information in the chat, but it has, you know, a lot of resources and materials that you can peruse through, and please share. We also ask if you would like to stay in touch with the Human Rights Commission for future conversations, that you reach out to hrc-roundtable@sfgov.org, and I'll also put that in the chat. But on this website, we have upcoming events and an opportunity for you to learn more about and be in future conversations on similar topics. And today we were talking about the ongoing tensions between our Black and Asian communities in San Francisco. But Stand Together SF is really a rallying cry across communities, because again, we know that this is not something that has been targeted to one group or another, and we would never want to participate in anything that seems to be, you know, qualifying whose trauma outweighs the other. You know, we all experience trauma in different ways. They're not always analogous, but we don't want to be in, you know, what has been called like the oppression Olympics. We know that there are issues across communities and across identities that feel and resonate differently with you depending on your identity. So today was about Asian and Black interactions in San Francisco, but in future conversations we'll be focusing on different communities, both, you know, intra-community tensions, and again, owning how the city can do better in reaching and improving these outcomes for folks. So thank you again for joining us today and for all of your amazing questions. And thank you again to our powerful panelists for all of your contributions.
Thank you.
Unless you want to say any closing words, Michelle, I think that we would end there. All right, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank you.
for joining.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all the panelists, and thank you to Michelle. Masterful moderation.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much.
Powerful.
Thank you. And yes, let's all be connected and stay in touch and continue the work. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sheryl.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Monetta, for joining. I know you were, and thanks, Claudine, for the recommendation.
Ooh.